Hello everyone. I have a topic that was often requested for you tonight. A long story about wine. We will touch on many aspects of it. Its history, its elaboration, geography, cultural importance, and also more practical things. How to approach wine out of curiosity and just for pleasure. Learning about wine and tasting it are like a journey. You can never reach the end of your exploration of tastes in all their variations, of textures, of regions of origin, of elaboration techniques. But I would like to make it as approachable and easy to understand as possible, because there's sometimes a form of snobism that comes with wine consumption, and that can be a bit off-putting. But it's just a drink. So I'm going to assume that you know nothing, which is fine, and we'll go from the basics of understanding where wine comes from. There's going to be a lot of history tonight to the various kinds of grapes and wines and how to make the best of them. I have everything I need for a little wine tasting session on my desk, so it cannot go wrong. Before we begin, remember that you have timestamps in the first comment in case you wish to navigate the story or resume where you left it. And if this works better for you, you can also now listen to my stories on music streaming sites like Apple Music or Spotify. I will also put links for you. And if you wish to support this channel and download audios or videos, you can do it on my Patreon page. I recently added lighter MP3 audio files that you can quickly save on your phone for easy listening, including offline. We are about to start. So it is now recommended that you adopt a comfortable position. It is perfectly fine if you decide to close your eyes. You won't need any visuals to understand what follows. And if you fall asleep, you may come back later. For now, try to focus on your breathing. For just a short moment, take one deep breath, and as you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders. We are now ready to begin our little exploration journey. Let's start with the most basic of questions. What is wine? 95% of the time, it refers to an alcoholic drink elaborated with grapes that are fermented. We'll see later what fermentation is. But there are wines made with other crops, many different fruits, or even with honey. For example, there are the so-called fruit wines, obtained with the fermentation of apples, also known as cider, and in some regions of the world, there is a local tradition to make alcoholic drinks with many different fruits, as long as they contain sugars that can be consumed by yeast in a fermentation process. It works. There's a sort of wine made with plums in Japan and Korea. And around the world you find wines made with all sorts of berries, with cherry, orange, even pineapple or banana. There is also rice wine, like Japanese sake, but as it is obtained through the fermentation of starch, it could be considered closer to beer than wine. And for this reason it is generally excluded from the definition of wine. It is called rice wine more because of its alcohol content, which is similar to many wines. And there is honey wine, mead, which is almost as ancient as grapes wine. Mead is created by fermenting honey mixed with water. It was discovered in China, in India, in Africa, and in Europe in ancient times. In colder regions where there were less or no grapes at all, it played an important role in the antiquity. Residual samples of mead were discovered in ceramics of the bell beaker culture from 4,000 years ago. I told you about this ancient European culture in the recent story about Stonehenge. In Scandinavia and some parts of the Celtic and Germanic worlds, mead was believed to be the primary heroic or divine drink, and this lasted well into the Middle Ages. Mead never disappeared, but over the centuries it became more obscure as it was replaced with beer and wine and other spirits mainly. Some monasteries kept this tradition, but it became more and more a folkloric kind of beverage or a byproduct of beekeeping. It is still a niche drink nowadays, but it's not hard to find and it's worth a try. But for tonight, we're going to focus on wine from grapes, which has always been the most widespread. And this is generally what we refer to when we talk about wine. This is a very ancient practice that seems to have originated in various parts of the world between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence of wine fermentation has been found in China from around 7,000 BC, in the Caucasus, in Georgia, in 6,000 BC, and a bit later in Iran, in Lebanon, in Sicily. The grapes put to fermentation were from a wild species of vine, and in all these regions pottery had been invented several thousand years earlier, and it is likely that ceramics were used as containers for the fermentation process. At least it is in ceramic remains that traces of ancient wine were discovered. One hypothesis about the discovery of fermentation is that in the Neolithic, people collected grapes, berries, all sorts of fruits, and after a few days, juice at the bottom of any container would begin to turn into a type of wine containing a bit of alcohol. The taste and the effects of alcohol probably drew their attention to this drink, and it began to be produced intentionally. But at least at the start, this kind of wine production was just domestic. The oldest winery in the world that we know of was discovered in the Caucasus, in Armenia. It is from 4000 BC, 6000 years ago, and it was in a cave that contained a press for grapes, fermentation vats, jars, cups, and seeds and vines of Vitis vinifera, the common vine, which has thousands of varieties nowadays, but is still used for wine production. It is also in the same Armenian cave that the oldest known shoe in the world was found. And this is unrelated to wine, but it indicates a degree of culture and even comfort in this region of the world that was probably fairly advanced at the time. 4000 BC is before the emergence of ancient Egypt. It seems the cradle of wine was in the north of the Middle East, a large region covering Persia, the Caucasus, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. What we know is that at the beginning of the Bronze Age in the Middle East, around 3200 BC, domesticated grapes were quite common and abundant in this region. Grapes was an attractive kind of fruit to domesticate and grow, because it is very productive, rather resilient, and it can be relatively sweet. A marked sweet taste was particularly attractive to our ancestors, probably because it was rare. They found it only in fruits, but not all of them, and honey. There was no sugar yet, and even when sugar production from sugarcane appeared, it remained a rather rare and pricey ingredient until modern times. So, with this abundance of grapes in the Middle East, early civilizations like Sumer and ancient Egypt adopted it. It is believed that grape cultivation began in Egypt around 3000 BC. It was centered on the Nile Delta, and wine was consumed all along the history of ancient Egypt. It is unclear whether wine was a luxury product or one that many people could afford, but it was typically part of the products people were buried with to accompany them in the afterlife. There are also scenes of winemaking on the walls of many Egyptian tombs, and the Egyptians may have traded wine with the rest of the world, but the one people that spread it all around the Mediterranean Sea were the Phoenicians. I told you about the Phoenicians in other stories. They were a people with a civilization centered on present-day Lebanon. From the middle of the second millennium BC, they developed a maritime trading culture all around the Mediterranean. They explored and created colonies and trading posts to the west, all the way to Spain, and including the Greek Isles, Sicily, North Africa. They faced competition from the Greeks later, who did the same thing, and the most successful of their colonies, which became a powerful state by itself, was Carthage in present-day Tunisia. The fall of Carthage, when it was finally destroyed by the Romans, can be considered the ending of the Phoenician era in the Mediterranean Sea, but this era lasted for more than 1,000 years. And the Phoenicians were skilled winemakers. Wine was one of the products they traded, and they developed amphoras, pottery vessels, in which wine was contained to be shipped. It seems wine trading boomed in the Mediterranean Sea around 1000 BC. The coasts of the sea were all populated. Wine was sought after, not only because people liked it as a drink, but also because it had acquired a status. It was considered an offering worthy of kings and even gods. At the time, it was the one beverage with the highest alcohol percentage known to most people. So it had an effect, of course. And most of Mediterranean wine was red. So it looked like blood, and it probably contributed to give it a particular sacred aura that made it appealing. The Phoenicians developed winemaking to the point of planting grapevines around their colonies. They introduced it in Spain, for example. They founded cities that still exist in the south of Spain, like Malaga and Cadiz, and later they founded Barcelona. All around these colonies they introduced grapevine cultivation, and they also accumulated knowledge about winemaking, including manuals and treatises that were later passed to the Greeks and the Romans, who also became experts at winemaking. When Carthage was at the height of its splendor, its wine was famous all around the Mediterranean, and the Romans translated an entire encyclopedia of wine by a Punic author called Mago. Punic means from Carthage. In this encyclopedia, he had documented all the knowledge of his time about wine, including topography, for example, on which side of a hill to plant vines, to shield them from too much or not enough sun, to winemaking practices like how to make resin wine from dried grapes. So the Phoenicians were important in the history of wine, and so were the Greeks. They may have started their development of winemaking imitating the Phoenicians at the beginning, but then they created their own practices and their own wine culture. Like Phoenicia, Greek cities became major wine exporters. The Greek amphoras made to store and transport wine were sent by boat to Italy, Anatolia, Egypt, the Black Sea, and to the west to what would later become Spain and France. They also introduced grapevines cultivation in Italy and France. Now, at the time, wine was rarely drunk pure. It was diluted with water. When undiluted, it was perceived as too strong and putting people at risk of losing control of themselves. The Greek god of wine, Dionysus, was also associated with the loss of control and orgies. He was basically the god of getting high. And in the works of authors like Homer, he was sometimes called Acratophorus, the giver of unmixed wine. In classical Greece, drinking pure wine was frowned upon. It probably happened quite a lot, but it was considered like something a drunk person would do. And classical Greece valued self-control and moderation above many other values. The Greeks were also the first, as far as we know, to develop named wines. They had realized how different wines could taste depending on the grapes, where they were grown, how they were processed, and their wine production reflected this. They had, for example, a wine called Coan from the island of Kos, which was famous for its saltiness. It was mixed with a bit of seawater. Or wine from the island of Lesbos. And to differentiate these wines, the styling of their amphoras varied. Many of these Greek wine amphoras have been found all around the Mediterranean by archaeologists, which is a remain of centuries of trade in the antiquity. But winemaking took yet another dimension under the Roman Empire. The Romans had a major impact on the development of viticulture. Actually, almost all the wine-producing regions in Western Europe, especially in Italy, in France, in Spain, were established under the Romans about 2,000 years ago. And they have not changed much since then. At the time when Greek and Phoenician cities dominated trade in the Mediterranean, wine was an upscale drink that was out of reach for a majority of people, except in very special occasions maybe. Under the Roman Empire, starting in the 1st century BC until the end, wine became an integral part of the Roman diet for millions of people. An indicator of this massification of wine consumption is that alcoholism was never referred to as a problem for the entire society before the 1st century. Some individuals could be accused of it, but it was not a social concern, and logically so because the common man had access to drinks with a low grade of alcohol, like beer, but beers with few alcohol because of a short fermentation. Social norms shifted in the 1st century when it came to alcohol. Wine was so abundant that even modest citizens' households could afford it on a daily basis, and drunkenness became a source of concern in Roman society. At the end of the 1st century, the first wine laws were passed to regulate this production, and they banned the planting of any new vineyards in Italy, for example. The Romans invented a lot of the practices that still are in use in wineries. They built special storage rooms for aging. They even created smokehouses that could mimic or accelerate aging. Wine presses became widespread in Roman villas that could produce their own wine, an ancestor to the system of chateaux or wine houses. And as certain regions and producers gained fame for their particularly fine wine, they created a precursor to today's appellation system. Only winemakers from a particular region could use it. Another innovation, this time in the storing and shipping of wine, was the progressive replacement of amphoras with barrels. Wood barrels were an invention from Gaul, and barrels were more solid and had a much greater capacity than terracotta amphoras. The first glass wine bottles also appeared. This type of bottles was an invention from Syria that spread around the empire. Actually, the oldest known surviving bottle of wine is a Roman bottle. It is called the Spire bottle because it was retrieved from a tomb in Germany, still unopened, and it is dated from the 4th century AD. To the Romans, wine also had medicinal purposes when mixed with herbs or minerals. Sometimes for better health, the upper classes would dissolve pearls in wine before drinking. This belief lasted for centuries in ancient Rome, and there is a famous legend about Cleopatra. She would have told Mark Antony that she could drink either the value of an entire province or a pearl necklace, and then she would have dissolved it into a glass of wine, either the necklace or a single big pearl, depending on the versions. During the antiquity, wine consumption thrived around the Mediterranean and in the Middle East, from Persia to Spain. But it did not really spread much further. To the north, the climate was not favorable. To the south, neither. And in the east, I told you earlier that remains of grape fermentation were discovered very early in China. But it never really took off there. The Chinese were exposed to wine several times along their history. They had contacts with the eastern part of Alexander the Great's empire after its collapse. Viticulture had been introduced to Central Asia. A bit was also imported under the Tang dynasty from the 7th to the 10th centuries, that is to say during the Dark Ages and Middle Ages in Europe. But it remained anecdotal in China. China developed other alcoholic beverages based on the fermentation of grains like rice, and wine never became widespread nor generate a lot of interest. As far as we know, there was no equivalent neither in America, even though grapevines existed there as a wild plant, meaning that the regions of the world where wine thrived during the Antiquity and the Middle Ages were limited to the Middle East, North Africa, and soon, above all, Europe. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, the one institution that survived and adapted was the Church, as Christianity continued its expansion in Western and Central Europe. Wine was important to the Christians as it was necessary to celebrate masses, so a supply of wine had to be secured. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, winemaking collapsed too, but never disappeared, and it evolved as European societies entered medieval times. Monastic orders became the controllers, the organizers of wine production in large parts of Europe. In general, the Middle Ages saw a big rise of monastic orders that followed different sets of rules: Benedictine monks, the Cistercians, the Templars, They controlled vast areas of land, not as much as the feudal nobles, but abbeys were also industrial centers. The monks were rarely inactive, and they produced relatively elaborate items from honey and its byproducts to wine, to books that were copied manually, to beer, and many more products that funded their communities. And doing so, they preserved and very often expanded technical knowledge in these fields. The Benedictine order became the larger producer of wine in Germany and France during the Middle Ages. They owned vineyards in the regions of Champagne, Burgundy, Bordeaux, and in Germany too, in Franconia and Rheingau, in the west of Germany. It is monks, for example, who developed the planting of Riesling grapevines in Germany. Riesling is a white grape variety that has become the most planted in Germany and also in the region of Alsace in the east of France. It is one of the most important varieties that give fine white wines nowadays, together with Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc, which are two other varieties of white grapes. It is also in medieval times that a divide appeared in Europe between southern countries, where wine became or remained by far the most important alcoholic beverage, whereas in the north of Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, ale and beer dominated. Wine was imported, but not consumed as massively in these regions as in Italy, Spain, Austria, France, or the south of Germany. In wine-drinking countries, wine was served every day in every well-to-do household. Merchants, nobles of course, high-ranking members of the church, master artisans. But even for more modest people, it was a rather familiar drink. It was also served watered down and rarely drunk pure, as we tend to do today. Generally, the dilution was at a ratio of 4 or 5 parts of water to only 1 of wine, meaning that the grade of alcohol in the final drink was only around 3%. It's not a lot. It's about half the alcohol grade of modern beers, and not far from ciders. With the end of the Roman Empire and large parts of Europe falling into chaos, long-haul trade of wine had collapsed, and it took centuries to rebuild it around new trade routes. Most wine production was for domestic use, but it started to change in the 12th century, when Western Europe entered a period of relative stability and prosperity. It was also the time when large Gothic cathedrals began to be built. The production of written documents increased. More and more land was cleared of woods to be cultivated. The main trade routes in Europe at the time connected the north of Italy with its merchant cities like Genoa and Venice to the other side of the Alps, Germany, France. The Rhine River and the Rhône River became major axes for the circulation of goods, and so did the Baltic Sea and the Atlantic coast from the North Sea to Portugal. large international fairs for traders appeared too, like the fairs of Champagne in the northeast of France. So regions that had been compartmented for centuries when it came to trade began to exchange goods. The southeast of England, Flanders and the Netherlands, the Rhine Valley, Italy, the region of Paris, cities from the Hanseatic League around the Baltic. And wine was one of the products to be traded, together with fabrics, wool, spices. New wine exporting regions appeared, and none was as successful as the region of Bordeaux in the southwest of France. Bordeaux was boosted by its political connection to England in the 12th century. At the time, the area covered by vineyards around Bordeaux was fairly small, and wine production was for local consumption mainly. Other regions in France, like Burgundy or Languedoc, were much more relevant when it came to wine production. But the popularity of Bordeaux wines increased dramatically following the wedding of the King of England, Henri Plantagenet, with Aliénor d'Aquitaine. Aliénor was Duchess of Aquitaine, a domain that covered almost a quarter of the Kingdom of France, and she was first married to the King of France, Louis VII. But after 15 years, the wedding had failed to produce a son, and she sought the annulment of it, which she was granted. Shortly after that, she became engaged to the Duke of Normandy, who later became King Henry II of England. Henry and Aliénor formed a very powerful couple in the 12th century. Together they controlled an Anglo-French empire that comprised Aquitaine, Normandy, and England. Aliénor became Queen Consort of England, and she was the mother to Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. The consequences of the Dukes of Normandy being kings of England, and this wedding that gave them control of large swaths of France, where supposedly they were vassals to the King of France, were immense in the following centuries. Many things happened in between, and the kings of France reconquered large parts of this Plantagenet empire until the 100 Years' War began. One of the reasons for this 100 Years' War being the legitimacy conflict between two dynasties that were closely apparented. They had many ancestors in common, and both had claims to the crown of France. But this is another story. So, when it comes to Bordeaux, the city became the base for Richard I's operations on the continent, and privileged connections between Bordeaux, Normandy, and England were created. Bordeaux wine exports grew dramatically from this moment on, most of it going to England, and the vineyards expanded to accommodate this new demand. In the following century, the 13th century, most of the Plantagenet Empire on the continent was lost to French kings, and Bordeaux was even besieged in 1224. But the city resisted and remained in English hands. This didn't affect the success of its wines, as Bordeaux became almost the only region to export wine to England. It received an export privilege to London, and it became the largest of all French winemaking regions. Bordeaux suffered greatly from the Hundred Years' War that started in the 14th century, and it was followed by the worst pandemic ever in Europe, the Black Death that ravaged the area by the middle of the 14th century. By the end of the conflict in 1453, the kings of France had retaken control of the region, and they never lost it again. But this didn't eliminate this trade connection that had existed for almost 3 centuries already. Relations between France and England were at a low point at the time, so to keep the business working, a privilege to trade Bordeaux wines was granted to Scottish merchants who maintained this connection with Great Britain. Centuries after it began, Great Britain is still the #1 foreign client for Bordeaux wines. Historically, the city of Bordeaux derived a large part of its wealth from this wine trade. It kept thriving in the 17th and 18th centuries when it diversified its clients. At the time, Dutch merchants began to place orders, and the planting of vineyards went through a new boom in the Bordeaux region. The spread of vineyards became so large that it was divided into specific areas so that the consumer could know where each wine was from. Maybe you've heard or read names like Médoc, Haut-Médoc, Grave, Blay. These are areas of the wine region of Bordeaux, and they are divided into sub-regions like Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux, Sauternes, Saint-Émilion, Pomerol. These are smaller areas with a particular topography and soil. On a bottle of Bordeaux wine, on top of the chateau, the producer, the equivalent to a brand, you have the region and sub-region. With the end of the Middle Ages and the arrival of the Renaissance, the wine trade only intensified, and more regions appeared on the map as purveyors of fine wines. For example, in Portugal, the wines from Oporto and Madeira, another kind that the British became fond of and imported. Actually, if you studied a bit of economics, one of the early proponents of free trade between nations was an economist called Ricardo. And to illustrate the advantages of free trade and how nations could better exploit their competitive advantage, he took the example of Britain and Portugal trading cloth for wine. Britain was better at producing cloth and Portugal at producing wine, two products that each country needed. So it made sense for each of them to specialize in what they did best and to exchange their products, which would make both nations more prosperous. Other wine-producing regions emerged in Spain, in Italy, but the one country that embraced fine wine production the most was France. New regions that exported worldwide, benefiting from centuries of experimentation, blending, aging, understanding of the soils and the climate, joined Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Loire Valley, the Rhône Valley, Champagne, Alsace in the east. Another notable wine region is Champagne, which I'm going to talk a little bit about because this is where I come from. Nowadays, Champagne is known for its sparkling, pale or pinkish wine, but it was not always the case. The first vineyards were planted by the Romans in this area of northeast France, and wines from the region, which were mainly reds, benefited from the traditions of French kings being crowned in Reims, the largest city in the area. Local wine was displayed at their coronation festivities. However, Champagne wine was very local at the time, and it struggled to compete with its southern neighbors from Burgundy. The climate in Champagne is colder. The soils are rich in limestone, and this made the wines more acidic and with low sugar levels. The cold also tended to halt fermentation in the cellars during the winter, and this left dormant yeast cells inside the wine. Of course, there was no understanding of this at the time. So this wine would be bottled, but then when exposed to higher temperatures, fermentation resumed, and one of the byproducts of fermentation is the release of carbon dioxide gas, which stays trapped inside the bottle if the bottle is sealed. This pressure often caused the bottles to explode. Actually, if you take a look at a modern champagne bottle, it is made of very thick glass because it needs to withstand the pressure even when the bottle gets shaken a little bit. But if the bottle survived, the wine was found to contain bubbles. This was regarded as a major flaw, and for centuries, winemakers from Champagne tried to avoid it, including a Benedictine monk from the 17th century called Dom Pérignon. There is a myth that credits him with the invention of modern sparkling champagne, but it's quite the opposite actually. He tried to get rid of gas in the bottles. He understood that gas came from the resuming of fermentation once the wine had been bottled, because due to the low temperature, all the sugars had not converted into alcohol. He was very important because he studied and recommended many practices that are still in use nowadays in winemaking. The blending of grapes from multiple vineyards, the pruning of vines, the conducting of harvests, the use of multiple presses to avoid maceration of grape juice and the skins. But he did not invent sparkling wine. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Champagne started to produce two kinds of wine, still and sparkling. The still red wine was never a big success. It still exists today, but it is fairly marginal. The pale and sparkling versions, bottled in stronger glass bottles, started to gain popularity at the beginning of the 18th century, after the death of Louis XIV. It became a favorite of the nobility at a time when other European courts emulated the French court. More and more winemakers started to make their wine deliberately sparkling. But the process of re-fermentation and the need for thicker bottles that could withstand the pressure were still not very well understood. Finally, these obstacles were overcome in the 19th century, and a profitable wine industry on a large scale took form around the modern sparkling version. Champagne gained more and more fame as a drink for celebrations. Modern houses were founded around the middle of the 19th century. Names like Pommery, Krug, Veuve Clicquot, Bollinger. One of the oldest is Moët et Chandon, that dates back from the 18th century. But then the region suffered terrible circumstances in the 20th century. Its vineyards were devastated by phylloxera, a pest that kills vines and actually ruined many European wine-producing regions at the turn of the 20th century. Then Champagne became a battlefield in the First World War. The front line passed right through the region, and many vineyards were turned into a desert of mud ravaged by shells. Later there were commercial setbacks. The American market was lost because of the prohibition in the 1920s. So was the Russian market with the revolution. Then the Second World War stopped production again. But Champagne recovered from all this and became extremely successful since the 1950s. Sales have quadrupled since then. Over 200 million bottles are produced annually. And at this point, production capacity is saturated because the area where grapes can be grown to claim the Champagne appellation is limited in size. But going back in time a little bit, wine had remained centered on Europe and the Mediterranean Sea for a long time, since the antiquity. But with European expansion starting in the 16th century all around the world, wine also expanded. Species of grapes were transplanted, first by the Spanish in Mexico. For Catholic powers, a local supply of wine was always needed in large colonies to celebrate masses. So the Spanish introduced it to Mexico first, and then in the rest of Latin America, especially in Argentina and Chile, where the climate with marked seasons and appropriate soils were available. The main production regions in the Americas nowadays are Chile, Argentina, and California. They all produce a wide variety of wines, but most of it is based on Old World grapes varieties. In California, for example, popular species are Zinfandel from the south of Italy and Croatia, and Chardonnay from France. In Argentina it is Malbec, and in Chile Carmener, both from France too. Wine was also introduced to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. Nowadays wine production is more diverse and extended than ever worldwide. The bulk of production comes from 4 countries: Italy, Spain, France, and the United States, following a long tradition that started in the antiquity. Wines are shipped everywhere in the world. In value terms, France accounts for about 30% of global exports, Italy 20%, Spain 10%, and then come Chile and Australia. So now, let's talk a little bit about all this complex vocabulary that comes with wine. Because to the beginner, it looks like a jungle of styles like red, white, or rosé, of grape varieties, Chardonnay, Merlot, Malbec, Carmener, of appellations, the areas and the processes, of vintages. All this may be very mixed up and confusing. This is a lot, but it's quite easy, and easier than it seems if we take things one by one. So first there is a broad typology of wine based on their color and their aspect in general. The most consumed type of wine is red wine. Its color comes from the grape skin, not the pulp itself, which is rather pale. Red wine is made from dark-colored grape varieties, and the red color comes from pigments present in the skin. The juice is greenish or white, but as the grapes are pressed, pigments from the skin are transferred to the juice, and during fermentation they develop. They turn into coloring agents. The skin does not only give color, it also brings flavor components. Then there is white wine, which is produced typically from green, yellow grape varieties. But white wine can also be made from dark-skinned grapes if the winemaker is careful to not let the skin macerate with the juice. For example, champagne is a white wine, or a pale wine at least, but one of its ingredients is Pinot Noir, a type of grapes that looks intensely dark. An intermediate color is rosé, pinkish, which incorporates some of the color from the grape skins, but not enough to qualify as red wine. Rosé is not a blend of red and white, it is just lighter in coloring agents than red wines. And there is another category of very sweet, often golden wines, called dessert wines sometimes. This is a vast category made of grapes with a lot of sugar, either because they are naturally very sweet, or because sugar is added, or because water is removed to concentrate the sugar. It can be by air drying the grapes to make resin wine. In colder climates, it can be by freezing out some of the water to make ice wine, or it can even be by using a fungus to desiccate the grapes with rot. These wines from dried grapes, heavy in sugar, are also called late harvest sometimes. There is a famous example of a sweet wine, which is also one of the most expensive wines in the world, called Chateauneuf-Du-Pape. It is a Bordeaux from the Sauternes sub-region of the vineyard, which is famous for its white grapes that are attacked by fungus. But far from spoiling the juice, it desiccates the grapes and increases sugar in them. The resulting wine is high in alcohol and sweetness, which is balanced by acidity. Buying a Chateauneuf-Du-Pape bottle is not cheap. An older bottle will cost in the thousands of dollars. But alternatively, Sauternes wines from the same area are much more accessible most of the time. And if you have a sweet tooth, you will love that kind of wine. So this is a first way of making broad categories of wine, the aspect and what they are made from. Then there is another factor, the grape varieties. All grape wine is made from different varieties of the species Vitis vinifera, but it has hundreds of varieties, with a different color, taste, and composition in general. The most used of these varieties are Pinot Noir, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Gamay, Carmenère. There are many. Now, one thing that often distinguishes European wines, especially French wines, is that these grape varieties are blended. Several varieties of grapes, generally 2 or 3, but it can be more, enter in the composition. These blends were elaborated after generations of tests and learning. The flavors, acidity, sweetness, aromas brought by every variety of grapes are balanced to give wine its identity. Given that they are blends, most European wines are identified by their terroir. Terroir is a concept that encompasses everything that determines a wine in its environment. It is, at the same time, the varieties of grapes used, the type of soil, including its chemistry, the climate, and the contrasts between seasons, even the shape and the elevation of the vineyard. New World wines, from Australia to California, all have these different characteristics too. But by usage, they are more often classified by grape variety rather than terroir, because they are rarely blended like European wines. Of course, to Chardonnay or to Cabernet Sauvignon from different places will share similarities, but there are plenty of other factors that will also differentiate them, which is why it sounds weird to French or Italian ears when people ask for a glass of a particular grape variety. First, because it doesn't tell from where you want your wine, and second, because there are barely any wines made of single varieties of grapes in Europe. So you're asking for something that doesn't really exist locally. Now, it's fine if you ask for a glass of Chardonnay in France, but unless you are at the bar of an international hotel chain, they will serve you whatever white wine containing Chardonnay they have, which is not exactly what you asked for. If you want to blend more in Europe, you can just ask what white wine they have, possibly with a fruity, dry and slightly acidic taste, which are the characteristics generally associated with Chardonnay. Now, the limited use of blends doesn't mean that New World wines are bad, far from that. There are excellent wines from California, Chile or South Africa, and they get better with experience. In my opinion, wines from Chile offer a very strong value for money. At this point, they are hard to beat. But my absolute favorite when it comes to reds is a wine from the southeast of France called Chateauneuf-Du-Pape, literally the Pope's new castle. But it's expensive. I have found a lot of Chilean wines that are different, obviously, but they are well made, subtle, satisfying, and they cost just a fraction of the price. Chateauneuf-du-Pape is a village near the city of Avignon, and its name derives from its history. In the 14th century, the region of Avignon became part of the Papal States when popes moved from Rome to Avignon. Not willingly, it was a move by the King of France to keep them close at hand. But for 70 years, several popes, governed Christendom from Avignon, and the city has a lot of architectural remains from this period. The papacy promoted viticulture in the surrounding area. For a long time, until the beginning of the 20th century, Chateauneuf-Du-Pape wine was not particularly sought after. Actually, a lot of the production was sold to be blended with wines from other regions. This started to change in the 1920s. Maybe if you have been around bottles of French wine, you have seen 3 letters AOC on them. They stand for Appellation d'origine contrôlée, appellation of controlled origin. This means that any wine using the name of a particular terroir, Chateauneuf-Du-Pape in this case, but there are dozens in France, has to come from it and respect a quite restrictive set of rules. The grapes have to be of a certain variety. They have to be planted on a precisely defined area with a certain type of soil. They have to respect elaboration rules. This gives you security in knowing that what you buy is not any wine from anywhere. Red Chateauneuf-Du-Pape wines are blends, of course, in which the dominant variety is called Grenache Noir. It tends to give wine an intense flavor, a little bit earthy with hints of leather or even tar. To balance it and make it more complex and less tough, it is mixed with other varieties like Syrah and Mourvèdre. These are the main ones, but there can be up to 13 different varieties, depending on the houses, the producers. They all respect the set of rules from the AOC, but it leaves them with a bit of leeway to make their own house blend. This wine tends to get better and better with aging. It turns more subtle, more rounded, meaning that you still perceive the variety of notes in the taste, but they blend together harmoniously. You move from one to the next when you taste it and back, almost without perceiving the changes. That is satisfying. Speaking of aging, this is why fine wines are dated. The year appears on the bottle, because once they are elaborated, wines don't remain stable and inactive. They keep slowly changing. In general, older bottles will be more expensive. It is not just because of the change and improvement in the wine. It also reflects the cost of mobilizing capital to make the wine, store it, and wait years to sell it. The same happens for whiskies and many other spirits that require aging. Wines that are destined to be aged will typically spend time after their fermentation in wood barrels. This stay in contact with wood is also part of the aging process. It gives them more aromatic compounds. Then they are bottled, and they can be stored for years before they are sold, or the consumer, you and me, can buy them young, keep them and wait. But it cannot be done with any wine. Many of them are not good to be aged, and long term they will just get lost and turn to vinegar. Most wines that get better over time are reds. When they are young, they will often look violet. then they turn more and more red as they mature. And finally, the oldest, finest red wines take a brown hue. Wine cellars are the right places to keep aging wine because they maintain a stable temperature. When keeping wine, the things you want to avoid at all costs are too much heat. It activates chemical processes inside the bottle and it makes it get lost quickly. Or too much cold, obviously you cannot let wine freeze, and you need to avoid the light too. So, all this being said, how to approach wine tasting? First, without too much pressure, for sure, because it is just for pleasure and out of curiosity. Interestingly, there has been a lot of experiments made with blind tasting, and they are humbling for winemakers. The general public, and also a lot of experts, are not that good at detecting where wines come from, at least when they cannot see a label or the color. And general members of the public are completely unable to distinguish expensive wines from inexpensive ones. But when they know the prices or the origin of wines, they systematically rank them or appreciate them very differently. This demonstrates the power of suggestion in perception and the effects of expectancies. But that's great news, because it means we can all experiment and try different tastes in wine without spending too much. So let's take all this lightly. It is just about enjoying it. And the best way to drink will always be the one that gives you joy. If you like to mix wine with anything else, serve it hot or cold, or even with ice cubes, then go for it. I'm just going to give you a bit of information and advice that may help you appreciate it better. So it all begins with opening a bottle. If your bottle has a screw cap, I'm not going to lie, this is not a very good sign. Most of the time it indicates a wine which is quickly made, industrially produced and in large quantities, and sold at a very cheap price. Typically your bottle will have a stopper that may be synthetic or, for finer wines, cork. The traditional way is to close the bottle with a cork plug, but you may also find synthetic corks which are acceptable. Experts criticize them because they may give a bit of a plastic taste to wine. And that's true, but natural corks can also affect the taste. And this is why when your bottles are stored, it's always better to avoid too much contact between the cork and the wine. So your bottle needs to be standing or slightly reclined. Cork bottle stoppers started to be used in the 17th century. They are not that old. And they are a good option because they are natural first. It is the bark of the cork oak. They are moisture resistant. They are very slow to deteriorate, and they provide a waterproof seal. The structure of cork makes that it can easily be compressed into a bottle, and then it expands back to form a seal. So we take out the cork with a corkscrew, and we are ready to pour the wine. The ideal glass is whatever glass suits you, but for tasting it makes sense to use wine glasses which have a specific shape. They are wider toward the bottom with a narrower aperture at the top, like a tulip shape. The advantage of this shape is that you maximize the surface in contact with air. The glass is supposed to be filled to about a fourth, where the diameter is wider, whereas the narrower top concentrates the smell, the bouquet as it is called. They also have a stem. This is convenient to hold the glass without heating the content with the warmth of your hand. Wines have an ideal temperature which varies with the types. Many whites, especially when they are dry and have mineral notes, are better served relatively cold at a few degrees Celsius, like 7 to 10 degrees Celsius, that's 45 to 50 Fahrenheit. Reds are often better at a higher temperature. When they are light-bodied, around 13 degrees Celsius, 55 Fahrenheit, it's fine. And the full-bodied reds that are aged, like many Bordeaux, Burgundy or Rioja wines, can be served at between 15 to 18 degrees Celsius. That's 59 to 64 Fahrenheit. These temperatures are not random. They help wine to develop its aromas. If you drink a complex red wine straight out of a refrigerator, the cold neutralizes many of its aromas. It completely eliminates many of its suspects, and you end up with a drink that is way more basic than it could be. So before we even try it, we may take a look at the color and the smell. Each wine acquires a different color, transparency and viscosity during its elaboration. Just by smelling it, a lot of different notes are going to appear. At the beginning, when you start tasting wine for the first time, it just smells like alcohol or like wine. But as you get used to it, you may be surprised by the variety of notes you can perceive. Flowers, fruits of all kinds, heavier scents like leather, tar, smoke, woody notes. There are many, and they are very subjective too. So instead of trying to name and count them, we may just appreciate them for what they are. And there is the color too. Its intensity varies with the grapes and the aging. Heavier wines tend to be deeper in color, whereas lighter ones will have more transparency and a more vivid red color. As you gently swirl the glass, the wine may leave thick streaks that are called legs or tears down the inside. This is due to viscosity. Sweeter wines are generally denser, and they will make these kind of legs appear on the sides of the glass. The bouquet, the aroma, gives you a first approach to how wine will taste in the mouth. The exposure to oxygen releases aromatic molecules. There can be dozens or even hundreds of different such compounds in a single bottle. Then let's take a sip. Once in the mouth, wine is exposed to body temperature, and this further liberates aromatics. So don't rush and give it time, a few seconds before you swallow it. We have 15 million olfactory receptors in our mouth. 15 million. So maybe take a moment to realize the complexity of what happens every time we taste something. The variety of aromas we may experience is wide. White wines are often associated with fruity and flowery descriptors: lemon, peach, apple, apricot, pear, rose petals. They may also develop mineral aromas like pebbles, nuts like almond, or grassy notes like fresh herbs. Reds are more often associated with black cherry, red fruits, spices, chocolate, smoke, leather, tobacco, pepper. One satisfying thing with wine tasting is that you get better every time you try. What at first might seem to be relatively plain reveals layer after layer of taste and complexity, all enjoyable as you get used to identifying them. And that's it for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this little journey to the world of wine, and you can now let yourself go to a restful sleep, or pick another story from my library if you wish to. I'll speak to you soon with another story. This time we will explore various legendary and supernatural creatures like werewolves or the Loch Ness Monster. But for now, thank you very much for your attention and sleep well. Au revoir.